Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission today is, well, it's highly ambitious.
You could say that again.
We are connecting three moments of, you could call it existential constitutional stress. And these moments are separated by centuries, continents, and entirely different forms of governance.
Right.
We want to find the universal DNA of constitutional collapse. You know, what happens when power stops being a function of the office and becomes entirely personal?
That moment. That's the inflection point we're studying.
Yeah.
When the formal rules, the written and unwritten ones, just yield to the ruler's personal will.
And to do this, we're drawing from a really extraordinary stack of sources today.
We are. It's all centered on the research of Mr. Zahir Ahmadmir, who is a lawyer and a scholar. And what's fascinating is the lens he uses. It's multidisciplinary. It spans law, Islamic history, and global thought.
And the flashpoints couldn't be more diverse. I mean, you have the internal crisis under the third rightly guided Caliph Uthman ibn Affan way back in the 7th century.
A completely different world.
Then you jump to the quintessential modern constitutional battle, Richard Nixon's Watergate scandal in 1974.
A battle of institutions.
And finally, a really complex case. The institutional deadlock in Pakistan during its 1993 dissolution crisis.
On the surface, you're right, they look incompatible. Like, what could they possibly have in common?
Exactly.
But the source material connects them all by searching for a ratio decidendi.
Okay, that's a legal term. Break that down for us.
It's a term rooted in judicial analysis. It means the foundational principle, the core reasoning that, determines the outcome of a case. We're essentially applying that legal framework to governance itself.
I see. So we're not just reciting history here. We're treating these massive historical crises like legal precedents.
That's the idea.
And the goal is to understand what the universal legal finding is. What's the core truth when a system is pushed to its absolute breaking point?
Precisely. The central thesis, the principle we're trying to extract today is this. Does the ruler operate above truth, above the law, or above accountability?
And the answer to that question is everything.
It's everything. The response of the governing system to that fundamental test, whether it tolerates personal power or enforces institutional limits, is what ultimately determines if the Constitution collapses entirely, or whether it survives and maybe, just maybe, emerges stronger.
All right, let's jump straight back in time. All the way to the 7th century, where the whole idea of governance, the system itself, was fundamentally different from the structures we recognize today.
Completely.
We are looking at the crisis during the later years of Caliph Uthman ibn Affan's rule, and the sources, they really stress this point. This wasn't just some dispute over who should be in charge. This was an early, and I mean profound, constitutional test for the nascent Islamic State.
That's such a vital piece of context, because unlike modern nation states, which are defined by, thick books of legal texts and constitutions, the early caliphate relied so heavily on shared moral authority, on the sanctity of religious principles, and, crucially, on the personal integrity of the ruler, Uthman, who was chosen based on a consensus among the senior companions of the prophet.
So the man and the office were almost one and the same.
In many ways, yes. So when that moral authority fractured, the entire constitutional structure, loosed as it was instantly jeopardized.
The expansion of the state must have played a massive role here, didn't it? I mean, we're not talking about the small community it was under the first two caliphs anymore.
Oh, absolutely. It had ballooned. Within just a few decades, the Islamic State had exploded geographically. We're talking about vast territories stretching across Egypt, Persia, parts of North Africa.
And that kind of rapid expansion, it's bound to create problems.
They created deep structural cracks. And those cracks, they became the triggers for the rebellion that Uthman eventually faced.
Walk us through those structural triggers in detail, because as I read through the sources, they sound, well, eerily familiar even today.
They really do. First, and maybe most importantly, you have acute provincial grievances.
Meaning?
Well, the speed of the conquest meant that new provinces were being governed from Medina, which was a very distant center of power. Imagine being in Egypt, and your capital is hundreds and hundreds of miles away, with slow communication.
You'd feel disconnected.
Neglected.
Yeah, exactly. Local populations and even the governors often felt neglected or in some cases exploited. This distance, it just amplified any discontent and created fertile ground for local dissenters to operate with a degree of impunity.
So decentralization created a pressure cooker.
A perfect metaphor. And that was coupled with significant administrative tension. Managing such a massive, diverse territory required really complex decision-making.
Like what?
A key example from the sources is the standardization of the Quranic text. Now, from a state-building perspective, this was necessary to ensure unity, but it also generated fierce opposition from certain regions and vested interests who had their own textual traditions.
So a move meant to unify actually created division. In some quarters, yes. It led to accusations that Uthman was centralizing too much authority in Medina, that he was erasing regional identity.
And then came the accusations that attacked him on a much more personal level. The claims that directly targeted his moral standing, claims of nepotism.
This was probably the single most effective political weapon wielded by the dissenters.
How was it so effective?
Because it was simple, it was personal, and it was hard to disprove. While Uthman defended his appointments, and his defense was that he was using qualified people known to him, people he could trust, the perception was something else entirely.
The perception was that he was favoring his own clan.
His own clan, the Umayyads, for key gubernatorial positions. And this perception, whether it was fully accurate or not, it didn't really matter. It undermined the foundational principle of meritocracy and fairness that was so central to the early state's moral authority.
So you have a state that's structurally stressed by its own growth, and now it's being poisoned by these internal complaints. And the sources emphasize that this environment, this discontent, it was aggressively exploited.
Yes, the factor of manipulation by foreign agitators cannot be discounted. The newly conquered territories, places like Persia and Egypt, they often contained entrenched political or religious opponents.
People who had lost power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they actively financed and propagated dissent. They saw the internal instability as a golden opportunity to destabilize the entire caliphate from within.
So this confluence of grievances, provincial neglect, administrative fiction, perceived nepotism, and external agitation, it's the perfect recipe for the last and maybe the most potent trigger of all.
Misinformation and propaganda.
The weapon that ties it all together.
This information became the oxygen of the rebellion. And this is where the sources identify that one specific pivotal moment, the breakdown catalyst, which transformed widespread dissent into open revolt.
The forged letter incident?
The forged letter.
Let's pause on this for a second. This incident is so crucial because it shows just how quickly a single targeted lie can completely sever that fragile relationship between a ruler and the governed. How exactly did this forgery function?
Well, the dissenters in Egypt, who were fully aware of the mounting provincial anger, they manufactured a fake letter. It was a brilliant and a devastatingly cynical move.
And what did the letter say?
The letter was allegedly sent from Uthman himself to the Egyptian governor. It supposedly contained an order to punish or even execute the very dissenting leaders who were at that moment traveling from Egypt to Medina to air their grievances with the caliph directly.
So it made him look two-faced.
Worse than that, it made him look like a tyrant who was luring his opponents into a trap. And crucially, the rebels intercepted this fake letter on its way back to Egypt.
Of course they did.
They did. And when they presented this evidence to other disgruntled groups, to the public, it appeared to confirm their absolute worst fears.
That Uthman wasn't the just, moral ruler they believed him to be.
But a deceitful tyrant secretly plotting against them while publicly appearing conciliatory? The immediate effect, regardless of the document's authenticity, it was catastrophic. It led to an irreversible breakdown of public trust.
The truth of the matter became irrelevant at that point.
Completely irrelevant. The perception of betrayal was everything.
And this seems to demonstrate a profound vulnerability in the caliphate's whole model of governance.
It does. When your constitution relies so heavily on the unimpeachable moral character of one person, a successful propaganda campaign doesn't just damage the ruler, it damages the entire system of rule.
It delegitimizes the state itself.
Yes. This loss of faith instantly escalated the crisis, and it culminated in the siege of the caliph's house in Medina by armed rebels.
And this leads us to the moment that really defines the ethical core of this entire segment. Uthman's ultimate refusal of violence. He had powerful allies, he had guards who were ready to fight to the death for him, but he forbade it.
His choice was a deeply personal one, an ethical one, and ultimately a political one. By stating, "I will not shed the blood of Muslims to protect my own life," he was making a choice.
He was prioritizing the unity of the community over his own life.
He was prioritizing the internal peace and unity of the Muslim community, the Ummah, over the defense of his own political office. It was a profound moral stand against sparking a civil war.
But if we look at this through the cold lens of constitutional collapse, he chose moral authority, but that very choice fatally weakened the political authority of the state.
It exposed the deep constitutional crisis at the heart of the system. Uthman acted based on a transcendent moral principle, right? But the state structure itself lacked the formalized legal or military institutions that were robust enough to manage the conflict and enforce the law without resorting to violence or without relying solely on the ruler's personal charisma.
So when he refused to defend the state's authority with force,
The state authority itself collapsed entirely. It led directly to his tragic assassination by the rebels inside his own home.
the key takeaway that the source material extracts from this is devastatingly simple.
It is.
This early piece of Islamic history shows that truth can be defeated by misinformation if institutions collapse. In this case, the institutional framework was just too nascent, too reliant on personal moral authority to withstand a sophisticated and cynical campaign of deceit.
It sets a high and a very tragic precedent. A ruler's personal virtue, however admirable, it simply cannot substitute for resilient institutional checks against political opportunism and organized falsehoods. Okay, so if the 7th century crisis under Uthman was fundamentally a failure of moral authority against, a tide of misinformation, we now have to make a very sharp transition.
A 1,300-year jump forward.
Right, to the 20th century, to a context where institutions were specifically designed and refined over centuries with one primary goal in mind: to contain executive power. We're moving to the Watergate crisis, centered on President Richard Nixon.
This is such a textbook example of abuse of power, but the comparison is really stark. Uthman faced an external attack, driven by lies from the outside. Nixon.
Well, Nixon was the source of the cover-up and the legal breach.
That's a critical distinction. He chose his own political survival over any moral or legal principles. So the question becomes, how did a system designed with checks and balances handle that kind of calculated internal legal breach?
And that is the essential contrast. Nixon's actions weren't just bad political choices or misjudgments. They were direct assaults on the legal process itself. They revealed the specific points where executive power becomes personal and then becomes unlawful.
So let's outline the precise actions that tested the system. We need to go beyond the initial burglary at the Watergate hotel itself.
The burglary was almost incidental. The crimes that led to the constitutional crisis were all about the suppression of truth and the obstruction of justice that followed.
For example,
Well, Nixon was actively attempting to obstruct justice. He was interfering with the FBI's investigation, using the CIA to try and block it. He was suppressing evidence, most famously, of course, the White House tapes, arguing they fell under executive privilege.
we'll come back to that.
And perhaps most dangerously, he was using state machinery for political gains. The entire apparatus of the cover-up was a massive abuse of the executive branch. It was used to target political opponents and, of course, to hide criminal activity.
So if the Caliphate lacked robust, formalized systems to deal with that kind of deceit, the U.S. system was supposed to be the absolute antithesis of that. What we saw in Watergate was the institutional response, the checks and balances finally kicking into action, not just philosophically, but mechanically.
Absolutely. The survival of the American system hinged entirely on one question. Did its institutional components, the judiciary, Congress, and the press, have the courage to resist the unlawful power of the executive, regardless of the immense political cost?
Let's start with the judiciary then, because the Supreme Court was absolutely pivotal, and it all culminated in a single defining legal moment.
It did. The Supreme Court's action in the case of U.S. v. Nixon in 1974 was the ultimate assertion of legal supremacy.
Remind us of Nixon's argument. What was he claiming?
Nixon had claimed that the doctrine of executive privilege granted him absolute immunity from the judicial process, especially in matters involving confidential presidential communications. He was basically saying his conversations were untouchable.
And that sounds like a powerful argument on the surface. I mean, a president needs to be able to have frank discussions to manage foreign policy or national security.
It is a powerful argument, and the court actually acknowledged that. They agreed that a degree of executive privilege is necessary for the presidency to function effectively. But
There's always a but.
there is. The court had to draw the line where that privilege meets the demands of criminal justice. And the ruling was unanimous, a critical detail that showed the system's unity against the executive overreach.
What did they rule?
They stated that generalized claims of confidentiality must yield to the fundamental requirement of due process of law and the specific need for evidence in a criminal trial.
In other words, they ordered him to release the tapes. And the legal reasoning behind that order is the landmark precedent that matters for our discussion.
That's right. The central constitutional principle was laid bare, confirming that the rule of law applies universally. The court said, in no uncertain terms, the president is not above the law.
A simple sentence with monumental weight.
It was the institutional system saying definitively that the office and the person occupying it are subordinate to the foundational legal text. This directly countered the personalizing of power that Nixon was attempting.
But the judiciary wasn't acting alone in a vacuum. Congress was simultaneously utilizing its own specific and very powerful tool for accountability.
Yes, Congress initiated serious impeachment proceedings. The House Judiciary Committee began drafting articles of impeachment
On what grounds?
based on obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and contempt of Congress for refusing to comply with their subpoenas. The importance of this institutional action really cannot be overstated,
Why not?
because it provided the political mechanism that translated the Supreme Court's legal verdict into an unavoidable political consequence. The court provided the legal truth. Congress provided the political teeth.
And we mustn't overlook the third pillar here, the role of the public sphere. The media and public opinion were the constant engine of accountability.
Oh, absolutely. The media exposure, led by investigative journalists like Woodward and Bernstein, kept the pressure on relentlessly. The slow, painful, daily revelation of the truth ensured that public opinion eroded past the point of no return for Nixon.
So you have these three forces working in concert.
Judiciary enforcing the law, Congress applying political pressure, and the public demanding accountability. Together, they created an inescapable legal and political trap for the president.
The outcome was definitive.
Nixon resigned to avoid certain impeachment and almost guaranteed removal from office.
The comparative insight here, when you place it next to Uthman's crisis, is just profound.
It is. Where Uthman faced a collapse of state authority driven by misinformation before his ethical choice, Watergate demonstrated that a democracy survives only when its institutions successfully resist unlawful power. The systems held. They forced the truth to defeat the propaganda and the cover-up.
Proving that legal accountability, enforced by resilient institutions,
is the critical difference between constitutional failure and survival. The U.S. system successfully depersonalized the crisis. It made the office accountable, rather than leaving the system to rely on the occupant's personal morality.
Okay, we shift now to our third case, a scenario that in some ways represents a constitutional minefield. Pakistan's 1993 dissolution crisis.
Right.
This case involves a parliamentary system that had been repeatedly destabilized, often because the constitutional text itself contained mechanisms that allowed or even invited political conflict.
That's a great way to put it. This is a crisis where the constitutional text was used, and arguably misused, creating instability even after a strong judicial intervention.
Why is this case so vital to our comparison?
It's vital because it really challenges the assumption that strong legal institutions automatically guarantee stability. It highlights that the political culture surrounding the institutions is just as important as the legal text itself.
So what was the situation in Pakistan in 1993?
The country was struggling to manage the separation of powers between a very powerful president and an elected prime minister, all under a semi-presidential system that was prone to friction.
And what was the inherent risk in that particular constitutional design?
The inherent instability stemmed from a single controversial clause in the Constitution, Article 582B.
Article 582B, what did it do?
This clause empowered the president to unilaterally dissolve the National Assembly and dismiss the prime minister if, in the president's sole opinion, the government could not be carried on according to the Constitution.
That sounds incredibly subjective. Very powerful.
It was. It was designed as a sort of emergency check against deadlock and corruption, but in practice it became a political weapon. It was used by the presidency to remove governments they disagreed with.
And this weapon was deployed in 1993. The initial breach occurred when President Ghulam Ishaq Khan dismissed the government of Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif. What were the stated grounds?
The president utilized Article 582B, and he cited a long list of reasons. Allegations of massive corruption, maladministration, and a general breakdown in governmental stability.
So on paper, it looked like a legitimate use of a written check and balance power. He was just doing what the Constitution allowed.
That was his argument. He claimed he was acting within the written framework of the Constitution, asserting his institutional authority.
But the judicial system immediately stepped in to defend the constitutional balance. This is where we might have expected a Watergate-style institutional defense.
And initially, that's exactly what we saw. The Supreme Court acted swiftly. In what was then an unprecedented move, it overturned the president's order. It reinstated Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif and his government.
A huge move for the judiciary.
It demonstrated a judiciary asserting its independence and its power to review the actions of the executive, even actions that seemed to be permitted by the Constitution's text.
What was the court's rationale? I mean, how did they justify overturning a specific constitutional power written right into the text?
The court's rationale was that the president's discretion under 582B was not absolute. It was not immune from judicial review.
So he had to have a good reason.
He had to have a lawful, justifiable reason. The court found that the president had failed to provide sufficient evidence for his claims. The ruling stated clearly, the constitutional balance has been breached without lawful justification. It was a powerful legal victory for the concept of parliamentary sovereignty and judicial oversight.
So the court upheld the rule of law. It forced accountability. In Watergate, the crisis ended shortly after the court ruling because Nixon resigned. Why, in Pakistan, did the Supreme Court's forceful reinstatement of Sharif ultimately fail to stabilize the country?
And this is the critical lesson that distinguishes Pakistan's crisis from the American one. Crucially, the crisis did not end with the court's ruling.
The legal victory wasn't enough.
Not at all. Despite the legal restoration, the political breakdown continued, maybe even accelerated. The relationship between President Khan and Prime Minister Sharif, both of whom were now technically restored to power by the court, was characterized by mutual distrust and open antagonism. The political infrastructure was simply too toxic to function.
So even a correct and courageous legal verdict couldn't fix the underlying political environment. The institutions were operating, but the culture was failing.
Exactly. It highlighted the limitations of the judiciary when the political culture is fundamentally broken. The conflict reached such an institutional stalemate. Neither leader would concede power, nor could they functionally govern together, that the government became paralyzed.
The state was legally intact, but politically defunct.
A perfect summary. And this vacuum, this paralysis, it necessitated a solution that went beyond the civilian institutions.
You mean the military?
I do. The crisis escalated until the army intervened, not, it's important to note, as a coup d'etat in the classic sense, but as a crucial mediator between the two warring civilian leaders.
They brokered a deal.
The military essentially brokered a non-constitutional political compromise to resolve a profound constitutional deadlock.
And what was the ultimate resolution?
The resolution was a result of that mediated stalemate. It required both the president and the prime minister to resign simultaneously, paving the way for new elections to break the gridlock.
So the Pakistan lesson is clear. Constitutional text is necessary, and judicial courage is crucial, but they are not sufficient.
Not even close. If the political culture dictates instability, if the major political actors lack the institutional maturity to respect the system even when they disagree, the system risks collapse regardless of the legal framework.
It tests institutional authority.
Yes, and in 1993, the civil institutions failed the governance test. They delivered a legal verdict but failed the political management test, requiring an external arbiter to step in.
And the source material draws a direct parallel back to the 7th century here, doesn't it? Back to Uthman's crisis.
It does. The observation notes that the echoes of Uthman are unmistakable. Political breakdown always begins when institutions fail to manage conflict.
How so?
In Uthman's time, the institution was too weak, too nascent, to manage a conflict that was rooted in lies and misinformation. In Pakistan in 1993, the institution delivered a strong legal verdict, but failed to politically manage the ensuing conflict, leading to an extra-constitutional resolution, the joint resignation orchestrated by the military as mediator.
And to introduce a point of friction here, isn't the intervention of the army, even as a so-called mediator, arguably an extra-constitutional failure in and of itself? The system didn't save itself. A non-elected entity had to step in.
That's the tension at the heart of it. That's absolutely right. While it averted a total collapse into violence or anarchy, it cemented the military's role as the final, unofficial institutional arbiter. And that is, by definition, a profound failure of civilian political maturity, confirming that the crisis tested institutional authority and found it wanting in the political domain.
We have now journeyed from the 7th century failure of moral authority through the 20th century success of legal authority, all the way to the institutional deadlock of Pakistan.
It's been quite a trip.
It has. Now we have to perform the ultimate deep dive synthesizing all the data presented in the source material's comparative table to extract those universal conclusions.
This synthesis is really the mission statement of the research. It confirms that universal test we talked about at the start. When rulers are either attacked by dissent, like Uthman, or abuse power internally, like Nixon, or the leaders in Pakistan.
The fundamental relationship between the ruler and the ruled is tested.
Every single time.
So let's rigorously break down the comparison points, starting with the core source of weakness in each system. Because the type of weakness seems to dictate the institutional defense that's required.
That's a great point. In the crisis under Uthman, the system's vulnerability lay in misinformation and propaganda. The weakness was that it was susceptible to lies.
Lies which weakened the state by destroying the foundational moral trust the entire government rested upon.
Exactly. Now compare that to Watergate. The source of weakness there was the calculated cover-up, a deliberate effort by the highest office to undermine the rule of law and obstruct justice. It was an internal attack on the legal system itself.
In Pakistan, 1993.
There, the source of instability was the misuse of constitutional powers. The text itself was weaponized by the executive against the parliamentary system. It highlights structural flaws in the political design.
So you have a weakness to lies, a weakness to internal corruption, and a weakness in the constitutional design itself.
Three very different vulnerabilities.
Okay, now let's look at the dynamics of public and accountability. Did the populace respond with fear, apathy, or outrage? How did the public react?
In the Uthman crisis, the response was a profound and very immediate loss of public trust. It was largely driven by that successful propaganda campaign that branded the Caliph as corrupt and deceitful.
The public believed the lie.
They did. In Pakistan, the crisis resulted in something a bit different. A deep loss of faith in political leadership generally. It wasn't just about one leader. It was continuous infighting that created a deep public cynicism about the entire political process.
And Watergate stands apart.
It really does. The dynamic there was an active, sustained public demand for accountability. This was fueled by investigative reporting and a core belief that the system could and should enforce its laws, even against the president. The American system successfully leveraged that public pressure to reinforce the institutions against the executive.
That's a huge difference from being victims of propaganda to being the engine of accountability.
A massive difference.
And this leads to the ultimate test. What authority was primarily being contested and either failed or prevailed in each scenario?
Right. In Uthman's crisis, the primary test was of ethical authority. The system demanded a morally unimpeachable leader, and when that reputation was successfully attacked by falsehoods, the whole system just collapsed.
In Watergate, it wasn't about Nixon's personal ethics, not really.
Not in a constitutional sense. The test was purely of legal authority. The question was simple. Did the president's claimed executive privilege trump the subpoena power of the courts? And the law prevailed, forcing the ruler to submit.
And in Pakistan?
In Pakistan, the test was of institutional authority. Could the civilian political institutions function effectively under the rule of law? Or would the constant political infighting necessitate an extra-constitutional resolution? They delivered a powerful legal verdict.
But they failed the subsequent political management test.
It did.
Finally, let's compare the tragic but crucial metric, the ruler's exit.
This is maybe the most telling comparison because it speaks to the structural integrity of the state at that moment of crisis.
Go on.
Uthman's ethical refusal of violence, his choice to prevent civil war, led directly to his assassination and the subsequent collapse of central authority.
A total system failure.
Yes. Now, Nixon, facing a unified legal and political system that was enforcing accountability, he resigned to avoid certain impeachment. The system forced him out, but the system itself remained intact.
In Pakistan?
In Pakistan, the breakdown was so complete that a mediated compromise was necessary, resulting in the joint resignation of both the president and the prime minister. Again, the system couldn't solve its own problem. An outside force had to impose a solution.
This brings us back to the core finding, the ratio decidendi. What is the foundational, universal principle we can derive from applying this judicial framework across these three disparate cases?
The foundational principle is, I think, absolute. No rulers above truth, law, or accountability. When power becomes personal, the Constitution collapses.
Explain that last part.
The moment a ruler places their own ambition, their own survival, or their own self-interest above the established legal and ethical framework, be it an ancient moral law or a modern written constitution, that is the moment the state enters a terminal danger zone. The institutions must force accountability, or they themselves become irrelevant.
We also have to look at the lasting impact of these crises. These weren't just temporary setbacks. They transformed the future of their respective nations.
Oh, absolutely. Uthman's crisis fundamentally reshaped Islamic governance. It contributed directly to the first fitna, the first major civil war, and it influenced centuries of debate over the nature of legitimate political and religious authority.
Watergate's legacy is just as huge.
It profoundly reshaped American democracy. It led to tangible legislative changes regarding government oversight and transparency, and it strengthened the institutional checks against executive overreach for a generation.
And Pakistan's 1993 crisis.
It significantly reshapes the civil-military balance in the country, confirming, for the subsequent generation, the military's role as the reluctant, yet in their view necessary, ultimate arbiter of civilian political conflict.
So what does this all mean for the contemporary survival of a nation under stress?
The lesson is clear and it's stark. Constitutional crises destroy nations when institutions fail to hold the line, whether that failure is due to fragility, as with Uthman, or political cowardice, like a lack of stability after the judicial ruling in Pakistan.
Yet they can also save nations.
Conversely, they save nations when courts, law, and ethical systems prevail, when they create a pathway for accountability and repair, rather than rupture and revolution. That's what the resilience of the U.S. system during Watergate demonstrated. The law must have the courage to meet the crisis.
This has been an incredible journey. From the 7th century moral test of a caliph to the 20th century legal battle of a president and the institutional deadlock of a prime minister. It really highlights how the struggle between personal power and the rule of law remains utterly constant across time and culture.
It really does. We saw that sophisticated legal texts, like the ones in the U.S. and Pakistan, they provide a powerful structural defense. But that defense is purely theoretical without the political will and the courage necessary to actually enforce them.
And we saw the opposite, too.
We did. We saw that moral clarity, like Uthman's, is vital, but it's ultimately insufficient if the systems surrounding that leader are brittle and susceptible to organized deceit.
So the ultimate conclusion, the moral lesson that the source material leaves us with, is this powerful reminder that we can't rely solely on the systems or the texts or even the good intentions of a leader.
Well,
A constitution is only as strong as the courage of those who defend it. And that courage, it applies not just to Supreme Court judges issuing these landmark verdicts.
yeah, but to the members of Congress holding hearings, to the investigating journalists digging for the truth, and ultimately to the citizens who are demanding accountability.
It is a profound call to institutional and personal courage against that constant tide of personalized power.
That's what it comes down to.
And this brings us to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over, building on this profound divergence in these historical outcomes. Watergate and Pakistan, they ultimately resulted in political resignations. They were managed, however imperfectly, by structural systems, the courts, the legislature, or a mediating force like the military. Uthman's crisis, however, led directly to collapse and assassination.
A total rupture.
Exactly. So does this historical divergence suggest that the simple presence of formalized, rule-bound institutions, even flawed ones, even ones that can be misused, like Article 582B, in Pakistan, provides a crucial structural defense against total societal rupture that moral authority alone or a less developed institutional framework simply cannot guarantee?
That structural defense, imperfect though it may be, it appears to be the line between a mere crisis and a complete civil rupture. It's the question that dictates whether a crisis becomes a turning point or a total collapse.
Something vital to think about until the next deep dive.